It began with the ordinary rhythms of daily life. A woman going to work, coming home, caring for her daughter. To the outside world, everything looked fine, routine even. But beneath that calm surface, something was stirring, something dangerous. She was a mother, a devoted worker, someone her colleagues trusted, her friends admired, and her child adored. She followed a schedule, stuck to routines, always looking over her shoulder, just in case. Because deep down, she felt it. That strange sensation you can't quite name. The feeling of being watched. At first, it was just a shadow on the edge of her vision. A car parked where it didn't belong. A text that arrived too late at night. But soon, the unease became constant. A creeping dread that no lock or alarm could silence. She didn't know the full extent of it yet, but someone was keeping tabs on her every move. Her habits, her whereabouts, her most vulnerable moments. And they weren't acting alone. What she couldn't see, what none of us ever expect, is how close evil can be, how betrayal doesn't always come from strangers in dark alleys. Sometimes it lives in your home, shares your bed, smiles in your family photos. On a quiet morning in Las Vegas, the alarm clock stopped going off. The front door stood ajar, and inside a small apartment just off the strip, a scene so brutal waited to be discovered it would haunt everyone who laid eyes on it. But the horror itself was only the beginning, because what police would soon uncover was a betrayal so cold, so calculating, it left even seasoned detectives stunned. Before the headlines, before the courtroom testimonies and the chilling confessions, there was Shauna. If you're captivated by true crime stories and want to stay updated on the darkest cases, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We release in-depth crime documentaries just like this one, uncovering the chilling details behind real-life mysteries. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button now. Shauna Tiaffay grew up in Reno, Nevada. She wasn't famous, and she never sought the spotlight. She was the kind of person who made an impression quietly, with warmth, humility, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to be loud to be noticed. Friends say she had a steady calm about her, the kind of energy that made people feel safe around her. And that was exactly who she was. Safe, reliable, kind to a fault. She put herself through school, worked hard for everything she had, and never took shortcuts. Eventually, Shauna settled in Las Vegas, where she carved out a life defined by dedication. She worked nights as a cocktail waitress at the upscale Palms Casino Resort, one of the city's flashiest and most well-known hotspots. The job wasn't glamorous, but she took pride in it. She was good at what she did, and even better at keeping her cool in the middle of chaos. In a town filled with fast talkers and flashy promises, Shauna kept her head down and her integrity intact. But her real center of gravity was her daughter. By all accounts, Shauna was a fiercely devoted mother. Her world revolved around that little girl. Every schedule, every sacrifice, every sleepless shift, her coworkers often said she lit up when talking about her daughter. There was nothing she wouldn't do to make sure that child felt loved and protected. She shared custody with her strange husband, and though that arrangement was far from simple, she always tried to keep things civil for the sake of her daughter. That was Shauna, a quiet fighter, a mother before anything else. She had endured a difficult relationship, made tough choices, and was slowly reclaiming her independence. She had goals, dreams, plans for the future. And that's what makes what happened next so devastating. Because years earlier, she had met someone who seemed strong, accomplished, trustworthy, even heroic. But that man would ultimately become the reason she never saw tomorrow. To the outside world, George Tiaffay was the kind of man most people trusted without question. A West Point graduate, a decorated firefighter in the city of Las Vegas. He'd served his country, served his community, and built a reputation as someone who didn't just do his job, he honored it. Tall, disciplined, and soft-spoken, George gave off the impression of control, authority, respectability, and that's exactly what drew Shauna to him. They met in the early 2000s, and from the beginning, George seemed like everything she'd been searching for. Stable, driven, protective. He was 6 years younger, but very experienced, and at first it felt comforting. He seemed to offer structure in a world that often felt chaotic. For a while, things moved fast. They married, had a daughter, and settled into the rhythms of family life. But what looked like stability from the outside wasn't what lived behind closed doors. Things mostly started going bad when George lost money in the housing market crash. Shauna told friends he had become jealous, controlling, and critical of her. Shauna's friends would later say that the George they saw in public was different from the one who showed up at home. Controlling, distant, angry, the kind of man who didn't raise his voice but could silence a room with a look. He started criticizing her outfits. He believed in dominance. It didn't take long for Shauna to realize that the protective instinct she once admired in him had a much darker edge. As the years passed, the cracks in their marriage widened. There were allegations of abuse, emotional manipulation, power games. Shauna began to fear not just for her happiness, but for her safety. At one point, she even filed for a restraining order, an act of courage that hinted at how serious things had become. There were counseling sessions, desperate attempts to fix what was broken, but some damage runs too deep. Eventually, they separated, though they never completely cut ties. They shared custody of their daughter, which meant Shauna still had to navigate George's presence in her life, still had to see him, talk to him, coordinate school pickups and weekend visits. She tried to maintain peace for her daughter's sake, but it came at a cost. George didn't take rejection well, and Shauna, quietly rebuilding her life, likely didn't realize just how much resentment was festering on the other side. What no one could have predicted, what no one wanted to believe, was that the man in the firefighter's uniform, the war veteran, the father of her child, had already started planning her death. On September 29, 2012, George Tiaffay arrived at Shauna's apartment with their 8-year-old daughter. Noticing the garage door ajar, a detail out of the ordinary, George entered the residence and discovered a horrifying sight. Shauna lying lifeless at the foot of the stairs, still clad in her work attire from the previous night's shift at the Palms Casino. He immediately ushered their daughter outside and called 911. What that child witnessed in those next few moments is something no person, let alone a child, should ever have to see. His voice on the call was panicked, urgent. He described what he saw. Shauna, unresponsive, covered in blood. The back of her head, he said, was bashed in. When officers arrived, they confirmed the worst. Shauna Tiaffay had been murdered, bludgeoned to death with what would later be identified as a hammer. She had been struck in the head multiple times, the trauma so severe it had fractured her skull. The brutality of the attack left no doubt. This wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, focused. An autopsy later revealed that Shauna had suffered 17 blows to the head with a hammer, resulting in severe disfigurement that necessitated a closed casket funeral. Oddly, nothing had been taken. Her purse, phone, and personal items were still in the apartment. There were no signs of a typical robbery. No ransacked drawers, no forced entry in the traditional sense. Whatever had happened here wasn't random. It wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was personal. And as investigators stepped over the blood-stained threshold and into Shauna's home, they began piecing together a crime scene that would raise far more questions than answers. Who knew her schedule? Who knew she would be home alone after her shift? Who had a key? And perhaps most importantly, who wanted her dead badly enough to beat her to death with their own hands? In the days following Shauna Tiaffay's murder, detectives were left with more questions than answers. There were no signs of forced entry, no items taken, no fingerprints, no obvious suspects. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing, and knew Shauna's routine well enough to strike while she was most vulnerable, A woman who had just returned home from a late-night shift attacked in the pre-dawn hours. Naturally, suspicion hovered over her estranged husband, George Tiaffay. The two shared a rocky past, but George had something on his side, an airtight alibi. At the time of the murder, he was working an overnight shift at his firehouse. Multiple co-workers placed him there. He had gone straight from his shift to pick up their daughter and then to Shauna's apartment, where to have found her body. His shock had seemed real, his grief believable, and most importantly, the timeline added up. George wasn't at the scene, at least not physically. The murder shocked the community and put Shauna's co-workers on edge. They started wondering if someone was targeting casino workers. And then a break. A man came forward, William Penix, known as Big Will. Big Will had lived in Las Vegas for years, working as a maintenance man at an apartment complex. He told police that someone had called him recently bragging about committing a murder. When he heard the details, he knew that he couldn't keep quiet. At first, detectives were skeptical. They'd heard wild stories before, confessions to crimes that never happened, drifters and addicts chasing reward money or attention. But still, they took the claim seriously enough to investigate. And so, they asked to meet Big Will. Big Will had a friend named Greyhound. He got this nickname because he was lean and quick. Greyhound lived in a tent in the foothills away from the bright lights of downtown. Greyhound used to be in prison, and Big Will was helping him get his life back on track. Once the two men talked, Big Will's goal turned into bringing Greyhound to justice. Big Will said to them, Greyhound frequently walks for miles from his desert tent to an Albertsons grocery store, where he has been seen before taking food. The detectives immediately went with Penix to search for him there. They stepped out of the vehicle and went inside to speak with the Albertsons employees, hoping they might recognize someone named Greyhound who fit the description. Big Will was aware that Greyhound occasionally sold drugs at the Chevron station next door. Then, a lucky break. Big Will comes inside to meet the police officers and tell them that he just saw Greyhound outside. Immediately, the cops followed him out. Cops identified themselves and immediately found drugs in Greyhound's possession, so they took him to police headquarters. Greyhound's real name is Noel Stevens. He denied he has anything to do with Shauna Tiaffay's murder. I have nothing to do with it. It's not me. You have the wrong guy, he said. He also says that he does live in the desert. He has a tent. While Greyhound was held on drug charges, a massive police search is launched to find his campsite. Inside his makeshift encampment, officers uncovered a few dirty bags, a pile of clothing, and hidden among them, something chilling, a piece of women's clothing. Immediate testing would confirm it belonged to Shauna. At that moment, detectives knew they weren't chasing shadows anymore. This wasn't some false lead or drug-fueled rambling. Noel Stevens was real. His connection to the murder was no longer speculation, and his name, previously unknown to investigators, was about to unlock the darkest chapter of this case. What remained to be discovered was who had sent him to do it, because Noel didn't know Shauna Tiaffay, or so they thought. The investigation took a pivotal turn when Noel Stevens, a 37-year-old homeless man with a history of felony convictions, confessed to the crime. Stevens revealed that George Tiaffay, Shauna's estranged husband, had orchestrated the murder, offering him $5,000 to carry out the act. This confession unveiled a chilling conspiracy that shocked the Las Vegas community. Noel Stevens, known as Greyhound, led a transient lifestyle marked by instability and substance abuse. His path crossed with George Tiaffay's years earlier when Stevens was living with his sister in the same neighborhood as the Tiaffays. Seeking to earn money, Stevens offered to perform odd jobs, and over time he became a handyman for George. This working relationship evolved into a friendship, with Stevens expressing deep admiration for George. Shauna never liked Stevens, always complaining that he made her uneasy. Exploiting Stevens' vulnerable state, George began to manipulate him into committing the unthinkable. In early 2012, George broached the idea of having Shauna killed. initially offering $1,000 for the task. As the plan solidified, the promised payment increased to $5,000. With $600 already given to him, George provided Stevens with a key to Shauna's apartment and detailed instructions on how to make the murder appear as a burglary gone wrong. They conducted several dry runs, including a prior burglary of Shauna's residence, to prepare for the final act. The depth of George's involvement was further corroborated by tangible evidence. Surveillance footage captured George and Stevens together at a hardware store purchasing items such as dark clothing, a hammer, and gloves, tools that would later be linked to the crime. Additionally, cell phone records indicated extensive communication between the two, with 87 calls exchanged in the month leading up to the murder. These records also placed both men in the vicinity of Shauna's apartment during critical time frames. The revelation of George Tiaffay's double life, a respected firefighter and West Point graduate by day and a calculating conspirator by night, sent shockwaves through the community. Friends, family, and colleagues grappled with the stark contrast between the man they knew and the heinous actions he orchestrated. The betrayal was profound, leaving many to question how such darkness could reside beneath a facade of honor and service. This case serves as a haunting reminder of the complexities of human nature and the depths of deception that can lurk behind even the most esteemed exteriors. While Las Vegas police worked to connect the dots between Noelle Stevens and George Tiaffay, there was someone who had already reached her own conclusion long before any arrests were made. Shauna's sister, Michelle Puentes. Michelle was living out of state when her sister was murdered, but distance didn't blunt her instincts. From the moment she got the call, she knew something was wrong. And not just because Shauna was gone, it was how it had happened. The brutality, the timing, the absence of forced entry. It didn't feel random. It felt personal. And in Michelle's eyes, there was only one person who fit that description: George. You see, Shauna and Michelle were close. They spoke often, and in the weeks leading up to the murder, Shauna had confided in her sister about George's increasingly erratic behavior. She told Michelle he was tracking her movements, showing up unexpectedly, calling her late at night. There were also the custody issues. George resented that Shauna was asserting more independence. She wanted control over her life, and he didn't like that. Michelle remembered those conversations vividly, the fear in her sister's voice, the tension in her words. So when Shauna was murdered, Michelle didn't hesitate. She told investigators, "Look at George." She was unwavering. Even when others saw a grieving husband, Michelle saw a calculated man capable of far more than he let on. The trial began in 2015, nearly 3 years after the crime. George Tiaffay was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, burglary, and coercion. Noelle Stevens, already in custody, had accepted a plea deal, 42 years to life, in exchange for his full testimony against George. When Noelle took the stand, he laid the conspiracy bare. He told the court how George had approached him months before the killing, how he offered him money, first $1,000, later $5,000, to murder his estranged wife, how George gave him a key to Shauna's apartment, how they even scoped the place out together days before the attack. He said George helped him buy the hammer, the gloves, the black clothes. It was all planned, painstakingly, meticulously, and coldly. The prosecution backed up his story with a mountain of evidence. GPS data placing George and Noelle together, phone records showing dozens of calls between them in the weeks leading up to the murder, surveillance footage of them purchasing the murder tools, and, most damning of all, Shauna's own words, messages and voicemails she had sent to friends and family, expressing fear that George might one day try to hurt her. Investigators testified to the gruesome crime scene, the pattern of control in George's relationship with Shauna, and how everything, the entry, the timing, even the positioning of the body, pointed to a killer who had planned this from a distance and manipulated someone else to carry it out. The courtroom was tense, emotionally charged, but for Shauna's family it was a long overdue reckoning. In the end, the jury found George Tiaffay guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Noel Stevens, having cooperated, received 42 years to life, but his role in the murder was undeniable. He was not absolved, only spared a harsher sentence. For Michelle and the rest of Shauna's family, there was no real victory. No sentence could bring Shauna back. But there was a measure of justice, a sense that the truth had finally prevailed, and the man who had stolen her life would never steal another moment of freedom. What lingered, though, was the chilling thought shared by many who followed the case. How could a man so respected, so put together, so disciplined, live a double life, so dark, so manipulative, and so fatally deceptive? In the years since Shauna Tiaffay's life was so brutally stolen, the pain hasn't faded. Her family has learned to survive with a piece of themselves missing, but never to forget. The one most affected was her daughter. 8 years old at the time of the murder, she had walked into that apartment with her father, not knowing what was waiting just beyond the door. What she saw that day changed the course of her life forever. No child should have to carry that memory. No child should have to reconcile the horror of losing a mother and then learn the father she trusted was the one who made it happen. Shauna's sister, Michelle Puentes, has spoken publicly about the deep scars left behind, not just by the crime, but by the betrayal. In interviews, Michelle has described the overwhelming grief, the rage, and the weight of trying to be strong for a child who lost everything in a single moment. She's also spoken about Shauna herself, not as a victim, but as a woman who loved deeply, worked hard, and deserved so much more than the ending she received. A woman who tried to protect her daughter, who tried to move on, who tried to escape a toxic relationship the right way, but was punished for it. During sentencing, Michelle stood before the court and said the words so many victims' families are forced to say, "Shauna didn't deserve this." She was right. George Tiaffay wasn't just a murderer. He was a man who wore the mask of stability, honor, and service while hiding something predatory underneath. And that's what makes this case so haunting, because sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones we should fear. And if you're fascinated by true crime, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon to never miss an upload. We have more gripping stories coming soon, shedding light on cases that deserve to be told. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next one.